Hi everyone, this is Elana Stein Hain. Welcome back to dinanddaf. It is the first shiur of Elul, and our topic today is Ayin Yafa, the idea of selling or giving or sanctifying, as in hekdesh, something with a generosity of spirit, in the sense that you mean to be more inclusive in what you are selling or giving or what you are makdisha, not less inclusive. So the example that we have in the Gemara in both Samach Dalid in Bava Batra, Amud Aleph, and Ayin Aleph in Bava Batra is we have the example of what happens when a person sells their bayit or sells their sadeh. Are they including a bore that could be found there? And the answer is no. But the question of Ayin Yafa comes up with regards to a machloket between Rabbi Akiva and Chachamim in both of the Mishnayot in those two places. The machloket is, well, if the bore is not sold, does that mean that the person who sold the property, who expects to be able to get access to her bore to get water, does that mean that she needs to buy a path, a strip of land from the person they just sold that land to in order to get to their property? And Rabbi Akiva says, yes, of course, because when you sold to buy it, the assumption is that you are selling the land with it. And Chachamim say, no, there's still a strip of land that presumably the mocheret, the person who sold, is allowed to walk on. And the Gemara explains, what are they arguing about? Whether the person who sells their property is selling with an ayin yafa, assuming that I'm giving my property and I don't have any rights to walk on it anymore, even to get to my bore, or is selling with an ayin ra'ah, meaning they have held back a path for themselves to get to their bore. What I think is really interesting about this concept is I actually think it's a huge chiddush to be Rabbi Akiva. To suggest somebody sells their land with an ayin yafa is, I think, more surprising than the idea that someone would sell their land with an ayin ra'ah, right? Because imagine when a person is selling, it's usually because they need money. They're not necessarily selling because they're excited to give something away. And so I'm not sure that they're necessarily in the most generous mindset when they're selling. Now, on Ayin Aleph, we see that somebody gives a matana, and this comes based on the Mishnah there, one of the Mishnayot that we were just talking about, that somebody who gives a matana, we do assume that they have an ayin yafa. Now, that to me makes plenty of sense, right? I would think somebody who's giving something away, it's because they want to be giving. So they want to be as magnanimous as possible. And so I think it's interesting to consider the opinion that's offered, in the name of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah doesn't say the words ayin yafa, but the Gemara suggests that that's what he means and that's where it's coming from. I think that's a big chiddush. And given the idea that that is a big chiddush, what I'd like to do is I'd like to see, first of all, in both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, several places where the Gemara is sort of trying to push against that idea that ayin yafa, that someone would sell with an ayin yafa, because it's so surprising, and maybe offers a different logic. So that's the first thing I want to do. Second thing I want to do is I actually want to look at Mishnaic and Toseftin texts, meaning I want to look at Sifrut Tanaim, the Sifrut Tanaim, Tanaitic literature, where ayin yafa does come up, and I want to see where it comes up, behekshir ma, with what, in what context, in what connection. Okay, so first things first, let's take a look. I'm going to share my screen. Let's take a look at our Gemara in Bava Batra from last week in the daf, from Samach Dalid Amud Bet, because I think it is one of the places where we see an actual push against the idea of a ayin yafa. Okay, so here goes. Let's make this good for everybody. Okay, so the Gemara, in describing what it is that Rabbi Akiva and Chachamim are arguing about, when they argue about whether a person who sells their house, and we assume that means their bor is not sold, has to acquire for themselves a derech, a path in the property that they sold in order to get to their bor, or it's assumed that they can walk on a particular path in that property. The Gemara explains it as, well, clearly Rabbi Akiva, who does require, the mocheret to buy a path, clearly Rabbi Akiva thinks Ayin Yafa, and clearly Chachamim, who do require the buying of a path, think, let's try that again. Clearly Rabbi Akiva, who thinks that you do have to buy a path, thinks that the mocheret is mocheret be'ayin yafa, and has given away even the path to the bor, or has sold away the path to the bor. And clearly Rabbanan, who think that actually you don't have to. That's because they think the mocheret is mocheret ba'ayin ra'ah. She is assuming that she wants to leave a path for herself to be able to walk to her bor. But then this is interesting. The Gemara seems to be like a little uncomfortable with assuming that there's such a thing as an Ayin Yafa, because the Gemara then says, Mimai, why do you think that is it necessarily the case that is the argument between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbanan, that it's based on this question of Ayin Yafa? Dilma Rabbi Akiva Savar, maybe Rabbi Akiva's logic is not about Ayin Yafa, but Rabbi Akiva's logic is actually not about the seller at all. Rabbi Akiva's logic is about the buyer. Ein adam rotzeh sheyitain ma'otav v'yidrusu achirim. Maybe it's not that the seller is so magnanimous that they're willing to sell even the path to the bor, and if they want to get to their bor, they have to buy a path back or buy rights to get on that path. Maybe it's actually that the buyer is very makbid. The buyer is a yeki about it. That, to me, actually speaks much more obviously than the idea that the mocheret has such an ayin yafa, right? So that's the first time the Gemara does it. Then the Gemara does it again when we go back and give another example. And it says, Dilma Bahapli, maybe the machloket in general in the two Mishnayot on Samach Daled and on Ayin Aleph between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbanan, maybe it's actually something else. To Rabbi Akiva Savar, Rabbi Akiva thinks, Batar data de lokeach aslinan. We are following what the lokeach wants, right? Again, pin it on the lokeach. Don't pin it on the mocher or the mocheret, because it's a little strange to consider that there would be ayin yafa in a sale. I also want to say that when you look in the Yerushalmi's explanation of the reason why you might say that when somebody is mocher, they are ba'ayin ra'ah, but when they are notein matana, they are be'ayin yafa. I want to look at the reasoning, and I think that the reasoning shows you also something about maybe it's a little bit different between, it's not just about the ayin yafa. So let's take a look. Okay. Let's make it a little bigger. Okay. So we have our Yerushalmi. It's hard to get to it. We have our Yerushalmi. It's the name of it. It's Yerushalmi Bava Batra Yudalid Amud Dalid, because if you're looking in the best version, the manuscript versions, or the early printed editions of the Yerushalmi, it's not like the Vilna where it's just Amud Aleph and Amud Bet. They have Amud Gimel, they have Amud Dalid. So this is Yerushalmi Bava Batra Yudalid Amud Dalid, and it goes like this, working off of the Mishnah on Ayin Aleph that you learned this week, whatever this week means in terms of when you're learning this. But when is it the case that we have this machloket about getting the mocher having to buy a path or not having to buy a path? B'mocher, only when there's a sale. Aval b'notein matana notenet kulam. But when somebody is giving a gift, it's assumed that they are giving everything. So the Gemara says, Ma bein mocher uma bein noten matana. What's the difference between a mocher and a noten matana, right? Why should one, maybe we assume that you don't sell all of it, and the other, we assume that you did give all of it. So Rabbi Ba bar Tavlai b'shem Rav shekain derech hanoten matana liot noten ba'ayin yafa. So Rabbi Ba says, when you're giving a matana, of course you have an ayin yafa, but I might paskin like Rabbanan when we're talking about being a mocher. Maybe there you have an ayin ra'a, right? So this is sort of assuming ayin yafa comes up in the case of a noten matana, but not necessarily in the case of a mocher. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yonatan. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman says, right? So that makes it sound, by the way, like, okay, so for Rabbanan, it's an ayin ra'a in the case of mechira, but for Rabbi Akiva, maybe it's still an ayin yafa in the case of mechira, and for Rabbanan, it's only in the case of matan. Fine, but look at the second explanation. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yonatan. There's a different explanation. Shekain derech halakuchot liot medaktikin. Because who is it in the case of a mecher who's going to want you to sell everything? It's not that the mocher is so magnanimous, it's that the lokeach is so medaktik, right? The same thing that we saw in the Gemara in the Bavli. To be honest, if we're actually thinking about the evolution of how it works, the Yerushalmi is earlier than the Bavli. The Bavli probably got the idea of, maybe it's not about the mocher or the mocheret, maybe it's about the lokeach being medaktik, that they don't want anyone walking on their land. Probably got it from the Yerushalmi, right? So the Gemara then continues and says, oh, actually, this is so interesting. Give us a nafkamina. What's the difference between whether you explain that the, issue here is whether the mocher is mocher ba'ayin yafa, or whether it's the lokeach being medaktik, ma beinehon, what's the nafkamina? What's the practical difference? The practical case difference between them? Hekdesh. The case of somebody being makdisha, of somebody giving to hekdesh. Manda amar shekin derech hanotin matana liot notin ba'ayin yafa. A person who says the reason why in a case of matana we have no machloket about whether you're being magnanimous or not. We assume that everybody's being magnanimous when they give a ayin yafa. So if that's the case, afa makdish ba'ayin yafa makdish. We also assume that somebody who's makdish, somebody who gives to hekdesh, is also having this generosity, right? Of course, after all, this is hekdesh. This is somebody who's trying to show their love to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're trying to show their fealty to the mikdash, right? But umandamar shekin derech halakuchot liot medaktikin. But the one who says the reason why in a mecher case we might say that, a person is not being so generous, but in a matana case, we say that they are. It actually has nothing to do with the mocher's generosity. It has to do with the lekuchot. When I sell something to someone, they are medaktik and say, no, of course you're not going to walk on my land. But if I give something to someone, they're going to be okay with me walking on their land. So the Gemara says, if that's the logic behind it, then ma'amar b'makdish. What do you say in the case of hekdesh, right? Like, how do you explain hekdesh being able to be ba'ayin yafa or ba'ayin ra'ah? How does it compare, right? So the first thing I just want to show us is that the fact that there are alternative explanations to ayin yafa in the case of the mecher, namely to put it on the lokeach, I think really speaks to a certain psychological truth that it is possible that, I don't know if really the lokeach, if a mocheret is going to be so generous, but a lokeach or a lokachat is going to say, get off my land. I bought this from you. What are you doing here, right? So that's the first thing that I wanted to just sensitize us to. And I love that the Gemara has these 3 layers, and the Bavli has it too, right? In the case of a mecher, in the case of a matana, in the case of hekdesh, maybe the psychology might be different in all 3. The psychology of the one who's getting rid of their property and the psychology of the one who's taking the property. The second thing that I want to do in our brief time is I want to look at the Mishnah in Trumot and some other Tanaitic examples where actually we do see the term Ayin Yafa come up. And I think it's fascinating to note that the place where we see the terms Ayin Yafa come up in Mishnah and in Tosefta are actually in cases that are not about selling or buying. So let's see the examples of where it does come up, this concept of Ayin Yafa, of having a sense of generosity. So first we have the Mishnah in Trumot. And the Mishnah in Trumot, perek Daled Mishnah Gimel, is talking about how much truma you should give. Because truma, there's no shiur for it, there's no amount for it listed in the Torah, right? Ve'elu divarim she'ein lahem shiur. These are the things that don't have an amount, right? So how much do you give? Well, Ayin Yafa, if the farmer has a generosity, echad me'arba'im, 1/40th. Beit Shammai says, Mishloshim, Ayin Yafa is a 30th. And if you're a Beinonit, rather than having an Ayin Yafa, Mechamishim, 1/50th. And V'hara'ah, if you have an Ayin Ra'ah, Mishishim, 1/60th. What I think is really interesting is, first of all, this is in the category of Truma, giving Truma to a Kohen. It's not about selling, it's not about buying, it's not about just a Stam Matana or Stam hekdesh. These are about things that you have to give to the Kohanim. And in fact, when you look at the other places where the concept of Ayin Ra'ah, or really Ayin Yafa, comes up in early rabbinic literature, specifically in the Tosefta, you find that a lot of these are actually things that people are being magnanimous about related to a mitzvah. So for example, the Tosefta in Peah, perek Bet, section Kaf Aleph, has hashibolin. I know it's written strangely, but hashibolin shebakashin v'shebasadot, and some people change it to shebashurot, hare elu shel bal habayit. It's talking about the mitzvot of leket peah and shechacha, and it's talking about a situation, it seems, when you are up to the point that you are a merit, you are making bundles out of your grain. And at that point, some of the things fall down. So are those things that you have to give as matanot to the poor or not, right? After all, leket, the things that drop behind you, is usually in the time when you're being kotseret, when you're reaping, when you're harvesting, not when you're doing a merit, when you are making into bundles. So what happens? So the Tosefta says, they belong to the Balabayit. They don't belong to the Aniyim. And look at this, Amar Rabbi Akiva, our same Rabbi Akiva from our Mishnah, where the Gemara says that he thinks Ayin Yafa, the mocher is mocher with Ayin Yafa. Rabbi Akiva says here, Bezo nahagu ba'alei batim Ayin Yafa. By the way, you should know that owners of farmers, they behave with an Ayin Yafa in this situation, meaning it sounds like they allow the aniyim to take it, even so, right? So interestingly enough, and that has hashlachot for whether you have to give maser on it or not. But those two things, truma and matnot aniyim, matnot kohanim, matanot of the kohanim and the matanot of the aniyim, are the places where Ayin Yafa comes up. Yet again, I would say, we have two more examples, Tosefta Peah again, and Tosefta Chulin, where it seems like we have a conversation about Kohanim acting ba'ayin Yafa, where either they get something and other Kohanim are waiting there for their matnot, Kohanim, matanot, their matanot, and they're not getting. So the Kohanim who did get, give them a little bit of theirs. Or we have a situation where the Kohen might be a little bit extra magnanimous to the Balim, to the regular Jews who are giving them something, right? So what's interesting here is, I would say, what we're looking at is in Sifrut Tanait, we're not yet talking about people who are just having transactions, selling. We're not yet talking about people who are just giving gifts out of nowhere. And we're not yet talking about hekdesh. What we're actually talking about is in a mitzvah context, the possibility of behaving with an Ayin Yafa. So where does that leave us? I think where that leaves us is what's so remarkable about the way the Gemara describes Rabbi Akiva, or the way one side of the Yerushalmi describes Rabbi Akiva's opinion, is that it's saying it's not just that people have an Ayin Yafa when they're in the middle of doing a mitzvah. It's not just that people have an Ayin Yafa when they're giving something to hekdesh. It's not just that people are having an Ayin Yafa when they give a matana, but we should even try to have an Ayin Yafa when making a sale. Easier said than done. But isn't that exactly what the work of Elul is? Thanks, everybody. Great learning with you, and I look forward to the next time.